Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you're listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Over the next 2 weeks, you get to hear a young adult romance with phoenixes. It's written by CK Beggan. She writes portal, romantic, and epic fantasy for new adults and young adults, and romantic fantasy and paranormal romance for adults. When Kate isn't writing, you'll find her crafting and going on little adventures with her intrepid dog. You may even catch her swooning over her latest Korean or Chinese drama obsession. Paeter and I will both be narrating today. Be sure to stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from the author. For now, please enjoy To Thaw a Phoenix Heart, Part 1, by CK Beggan. Chapter 1. Era. They weren't back. Still. Era gnawed her lower lip, tired of trying to sleep. The supply runs always kept to a strict schedule. How were they supposed to make their way through what used to be the city of Cleveland, when they could barely see 10 feet in front of them? The shimmering snowflakes were doubling up now, fat and wet when they struck the windows at the front of the gathering house. For just a moment, lightning cracked through the pitch-black clouds, and Era could see just how many bodies were pressed into this room, the darkness peeling back from the half of the hall used for sleeping. Other than their dwindling supply of candles, that bolt was the only light they'd had since running out of fuel 2 weeks prior. They won't be able to find their way. The old avenues and crumbling buildings formed an almost grid of sorts. But when snow fell heavily like this, all sense of direction disappeared. Era knew this firsthand. The day she'd come to the habitats, she and her father had barely made it. If the supply team was going to make it back to the old zoo-turned-settlement, somebody needed to help them. Tonight, that somebody was going to be Era. She collected her walking stick from where it rested beside her mat, using the soft light of the lanterns at the front of the large open room to pick her way between sleeping mats, both occupied and not. The trouble was, Era wasn't as nimble as she used to be. As her tired legs shuffled forward, she caught her toe on an empty mat. The crinkle of woven plastic bags gave her away at once. Mar, that busybody, peeled open a lid. Mar's single open eye fixed on Era immediately. "Where do you think you're going? You should be resting, Era Grande." Era hitched up a shoulder. "I can't sleep." "You certainly won't, wandering like that. You need to keep your body warm." Mar was actually right. The gathering house was getting colder by the hour, leaving Era's nose red and a little numb. She rubbed at it. "I'll stay warmer moving. I need to go to the outhouse anyway." Ignoring Mar's protests, Era picked her way through the sleepers, nodding at the adults still up and talking in low voices at the gathering house's front entrance. "Her runs are never this late. Must have hit snow further out," a member of the leadership team said in a low voice. "Maybe they're bedded down somewhere for the night. Who would raid a supply team in this weather?" "Desperate people," came a ground-out reply. "Hungry, cold ones." Though the leadership dropped their voices to a whisper as Era neared, the worry in their voices was unmistakable. Slowly, she made her way out the side door that led to the outhouses, nodding at the huddled form of the watcher waiting by the boarded glass door. The moment Era left the safety of the gathering house, she grasped at the guide ropes strewn across the entire compound for nights such as this, full of dizzying snowflakes and whipping wicked winds. When the juncture came before the outhouses, Era checked to see if the watcher was paying attention. A haze of white hung between her and the darkened building. Swallowing a lump in her throat, Era turned right and began to ascend the slope, the ropeway tight in one hand and her walking stick held firmly in the other. Her jaw was set to the point of aching as she faced the blizzard head on. The only sound in the abandoned zoo was the wind's howl. This was the stupidest thing she'd ever done, being out in the storm. Still, she trudged on, taking the path around the lake and cutting through the old giraffe habitat. She was traveling downhill now. The hard part was done. Well, almost done. Era stamped the blood back into her feet and headed for the staff shed in the outback. The moment she pried off the lock, the gemmy yellow eyes of a dusty dragon lantern stared back at her. Perfect. Era shimmied the head on over her body so her hands would remain free, then waddled up the snowy path to the wilderness trek by following her own footprints. When she reached the ridge, she lit a misshapen candle from her pocket with an equally precious match, then carefully lowered the dragon's head over it. Suddenly, the black and blinding white night was filled with warm color. The orange and red hues of the dragon lantern somehow made the little candle seem brighter. She hoped the supply team would see it. Just a touch of luminance through the driving snow that said the settlement was here, to say that everyone was waiting for them. If anything was worth breaking the habitat's rules, it was that. Era crossed her numb fingers and began the trek back to the gathering house, her footprints already filling in.
Chapter 2. Devlin. We carried our carts through absolute darkness, the blizzard nearly snuffing out our lamps, Juliana said, holding attention as she paused to take a sip of the hot water she'd been offered. We made our way up broken streets by the lightning that forked the snow clouds and stumbled along, weary, frost-nipped, and despairing, until a strange, as she drew out the word theatrically, Devlin flared his nostrils. Bizarre, unthinkable thing happened. A dragon sat on the distant ridge, puffing fire. The children of the habitats exclaimed in wonder, asking whether dragons were real. They were real. It was because of humans that they were extinct now. As Juliana went on, conveniently leaving out the worst parts of their trip, Devlin found his attention wandering to the girl seated next to him. She was small, as most humans around Devlin's age tended to be, with round cheeks that somehow still managed to look hollow. She had a different look about her, bright-eyed, unusual, pretty, his traitorous mind supplied him. And she was trying her best to keep a straight face during the story. Juliana couldn't stick to the facts if civilization depended on it, she murmured to the man next to her. He jabbed her in reply. As if he'd received that hard nudge too, a realization hit Devlin Song square in the face. He wanted to hold the girl's hand, as if it was the most natural thing in the world for a phoenix to show affection to a vile human. Her hand rested in the narrow space between them. For just a second, shifting his hand so his fingers grazed hers seemed like a fantastic idea. Fortunately, he stopped himself before he did something stupid. Where did such an absurd thought even come from? Equally absurd, her wind-burned, freckled cheeks and that hitched-up corner of her mouth left him certain she was responsible for the so-called dragon on the ridge. Interesting. Flexing his fingers now, Devlin moved them away from the tempting hand of the girl next to him. One of the nurturers came by and draped a heavy blanket over his shoulders. As an ice phoenix, Devlin didn't actually feel the cold, not like his father, whose teeth chattered despite himself. Still, Cyril wouldn't admit that anything could dampen his inner flame. But this storm Devlin had brewed was strong enough to do it. Devlin glanced at his father, worry cresting his brow. Hadn't they gone too far this time? His father had done his best to mislead and delay the supply run while Devlin whipped the murky atmosphere into a frenzy. That was the plan. The supply team would never reach the habitats. The humans there would run out of fuel, and then they would be forced to either disperse or freeze to death. What a cruel way to go. But that was their mission. The humans needed to be punished, and the Earth restored. Devlin stole another glance at the girl. Then he wrapped the blanket more tightly around himself, hoping its warmth would account for the heat rising to his cheeks. If only. Cyril turned his sharp eyes towards his son and scowled, even as the snow from Devlin's storm piled higher against the front windows. Every few minutes, the boards over them rattled fiercely.
Chapter 3. Era. They used to have medicine for Era's condition. What drugs they had ran out long ago, and now Era was left with piecemeal treatments, barely able to get enough salt to ease the dizziness, and living with a frequently racing heart. Today, she wrapped her legs extra tightly before standing, hoping to stave off the wooziness being on her feet would bring. Mar watched her judgmentally from her mat, as if Era wouldn't do it right. When Mason asked Mar to watch over her while she was in the women's section, instead of leaving her care to the busy nurturers, Mar had taken the request far too seriously. Era stood a little too quickly, leaning heavily on her stick, and set off before the wooziness had time to resolve. The last thing she wanted was to be followed by the busybody. She didn't even spare a glance at the men's section to see if Mason had already risen for the day or not. After last night's excitement, there were more sleepers on the mats than out of them. Era cut a path for the kitchen. "Out!" one of the chefs commanded before she could open her mouth to say hello. "Good morning to you, too," Era replied, undaunted. She shuffled into the kitchen anyway, reveling in the smell of oats cooking on the fire and clay stovetop. The former catering space had been retrofitted with these simpler materials, with a fireplace built into the back wall so the staff could cook over a wood fire if the cleaner fuels ran out. For today, at least, that fireplace remained dark and cold. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to put Era, or any of them, judging by Chef's snappish demeanor, at ease. The catering space also doubled as the food storage center. Even after the successful run, too many of its shelves and storage bins remained empty. At least the supply relay had given them some walnuts this time. Their container sat open on the counter, tempting Era with the promise of a crisp, savory bite. But her attempt to casually move by and snake her hand into the bin was met with a slap from one of the kitchen boys. She glowered at him, withdrawing the injured hand as though it was sprained. "Good morning," a flat and obviously sleepy voice proclaimed. Era turned slowly, intending to offer him her exact opinion of how the day was shaping up, and stopped dead. The boy who'd sat next to her last night now stood in the doorway, yawning and then trying to smooth his tousled hair. His effort was not a success. When the cooks immediately began to fuss over him, Era offered him a moue of displeasure as she tried to remember his name. Declan or something? There were too many new faces here as conditions worsened in the south and along the coast. "That's our hero," Chef Beatrice, who'd tried to send Era away, exclaimed at the sight of him. Chef was beaming, like it was the subsistence garden's first harvest in spring. "You shouldn't be up so early after the night you had. Why don't you sit over there? I'll fix you a bowl." Era clucked her tongue at him. "I suppose all I had to do to be offered early breakfast and a chair was be foolhardy too, Declan." The boy's brow held a deep furrow as he replied, My name is Devlin. Devlin Song. As if he hadn't meant to correct her, his mouth snapped shut. After taking the corner chair Chef Beatriz had offered him, Devlin hesitantly asked her, "Why am I foolhardy?" A thrill went through her at his surprisingly deep voice. Why hadn't she noticed it before? Probably because all they'd said to each other were polite greetings, and because she was always distracted, thinking of what scraps she could repurpose and how. Era shrugged in reply to him and tried to filch a walnut. Again, the kitchen boy was too fast for her. "You just moved here," she said to Devlin, trying to keep her tone light rather than suspicious. "And you volunteered for the most dangerous position there is." Devlin lowered his head. "I don't mind traveling." "You barely spent any time here before you left." Her finger pointed at him. "Era, leave the boy alone," Chef Beatriz warned. "Some people like earning their meals." "I earn my meals," Era replied sharply, narrowing her eyes. "I'm a keeper, remember?" Chef rolled her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Before Era could retort, the cook was scooping steaming oats from the pot and adding a very generous handful of walnuts into a bowl. As Devlin received it from her with a murmur of thanks, Era's stomach growled loudly. "Wait your turn," Chef Beatriz scolded, as if Era could control her stomach. "You're 16 now. You're not a child anymore. You need to act like it." "I'm not acting like a child," she almost bit back. Sure, she was mischievous, impatient. Mason would say impulsive. Her father used to say reckless. And not the best with secrets. Which was probably why no one trusted her with them anymore. But she was trying to change. Didn't her good intentions matter? Era needed to have everyone's trust if they were going to let her stay on as a keeper. She didn't think it was boasting to say her father was the best there was, and he'd taught her everything he had known. He'd doubled the size of a dozen settlements before they came up north for the fresh water, all with her at his side. In the year before he died, he often remarked that she'd outstrip him someday. Patience, though, to get to that stage, that was a harder thing to master. Case in point, Era was just about to give up on breakfast when a low voice rose from the corner. "If it wasn't for Era, we wouldn't have made it back last night." Era froze. Her walking stick angled forward, and her weight shifted onto the ball of one foot. How does he know? "What?" Chef blinked furiously as her eyes darted between Devlin and Era. "What do you mean?" "She set up the beacon," Devlin said. "The dragon the storyteller spoke of. It was how we found our way back." Chef's mouth fell open. How do you know that?" Era demanded, not bothering to deny it. Even if it did mean dealing with Mason fretting over her for going out in the storm and the cold. And breaking the rules. The boy shrugged, wearing a slight smile that somehow changed his countenance completely. "I figured it out." Before she had time to question him further, a warm bowl was pressed into Era's hands. "Thank you," Chef Beatriz said sincerely. "My fae is in the supply team." Era gaped back at her, stunned. "I know," she replied, though in truth she didn't know Faye's name, just that she was Chef's daughter. With a nod and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, Chef Beatriz turned back to her work, leaving Era to her oats and walnuts, and to the mystery of how Devlin had figured her out. When she passed by him, he only offered her an impish half-smile. "Looks like I'm not the only troublemaker here after all."
Chapter 4. Devlin. Hey! A girl's voice greeted him, startling him out of the monotony of his task. Do you want to go on an adventure? Devlin's head snapped up from the sleeping mat he was repairing. What was the lantern girl doing in the men's sleeping section? Didn't they have strict rules about that? What do you mean? He offered his customary frown, hoping it would chase her off. It didn't. She remained rooted to the spot, one hip jutted out as she leaned into her walking stick. I can take you to see the old lanterns, she replied, adding in a whisper, You know, the dragon from the other night? To the girl, it might have looked like he was casting about for reactions, wondering whether they'd get into trouble for crossing that imaginary line. In truth, Devlin searched for his father. Since he was nowhere in sight, Devlin found himself answering without much further thought, Sure. Why did you agree? Mentally, he cursed at himself even as he followed her. Why was he so drawn to this girl? Given the chance, she would undoubtedly be just as destructive as the rest of her kind. She'd destroyed everything she touched, too. Era. Her name is Era, his unhelpful mind supplied. Devlin bit his lower lip and followed her out the side door. The snow rose to mid-shin where it hadn't already been trampled by hurried feet on their way to the outhouse. Once they turned, however, there were only 2 or 3 sets of prints to follow. He stepped into them carefully, ill at ease as he followed this path the humans had made. Era, on the other hand, shuffled straight through, the plastic bandages made from what his father called shopping bags shielding her legs from the dampening effects of the snow. Devlin had no such protection. It wasn't as though he minded the cold. He only worried she would notice. Before their great civilizations finally fell, most humans didn't know immortals still existed on Earth. Devlin's father wanted it kept that way. Humans, he said, hated what they didn't understand. And so, Devlin tried to blend in, even if it meant donning gloves and coats he didn't need, or insulating his boots. It made him uncomfortably warm, as he was now, following Era. He longed to drop face first into the snow and cool off. Are you all right? She asked, grasping the guide rope as she turned around. Her brow was furrowed with one of those peculiar human emotions, concern. Given what they had done to the earth, it was bizarre that one of them would ever feel this way over something as minor as falling behind. And he had fallen behind. Devlin was roasting. I'm fine, he said stiffly, all too aware of the sweat trailing down his brow. Whatever you say, she muttered. Just don't have a heart attack out here. A heart attack? Devlin wished he could laugh. He wished he could tell anyone why that was so funny. Because at times like this, with heat building in his body, he could almost believe he had a warm, flesh-and-blood heart. As they continued on, the distance between him and Era seemed to lessen. She was slowing her pace. Whether it was for his benefit or because of the steep slopes, he could not guess. He had heard humans could be caring like that, though he'd rarely seen the evidence firsthand. Your breakfast this morning, his traitorous mind reminded him. Everyone fussed over you. He told his mind to be quiet. They're good to me because I did something for them, not out of any inherent kindness. Humans didn't know the meaning of the word. Kindness was rebuilding his life again and again just to carry out the final mission of the true immortals. It was justice wrapped in dedication. As he thought this, he collided with Era's back. Her free hand flailed wildly. The girl fell to one knee in the snow, her grip on her walking stick all that saved her from falling backward. And that free hand, for some reason, Devlin was holding it. Whoa there, she exclaimed, already standing and dusting off her flannel-patched jeans. Somebody was lost in some serious thought. Devlin's brow creased in confusion. What do you mean? Looks like you had a pretty bad storm happening, she said with a laugh. Right up here. To his horror, she reached up and tapped his forehead with her glove. Devlin frowned, waving her away. I wasn't thinking anything. Sure you weren't. Era gave him one last studious glance before turning toward the low building's door. You're a strange one, Devlin Song of the supply team. Devlin would have crossed his arms if he weren't still burning up. How was he acting strange? He wasn't supposed to stand out. Era pulled a collection of keys from her pocket and opened the door. The wind had drifted the snow high against the building, providing some relief for Devlin as it filled in the gaps between his shins and his boots. He almost didn't notice that Era held the door open for him. "Chop chop," she said, one of those mystifying and dark-sounding human expressions. He slipped in ahead of her, even though the room was pitch black. The door snapped shut behind them. In the darkness, he was suddenly aware of her breath, of the heat from her nearby body. It was too much. Devlin squeezed his eyes closed, trying to shut out all the repulsive sensations being near a human brought. The familiar click of a lantern had him peeling open one lid. Era had found it by touch, bringing dim light to the room, along with the acrid scent of linseed oil. Both eyes now open, he gaped at what it shone upon. These were lanterns, bits of human craft, not efficient for lighting the night, but there to be enjoyed for the colors they brought, the festivity. "Koalas used to live here," Era said, not at all awed by the brightly colored lanterns displayed around the room. "I think." "How do you know?" he asked, his gloved hand reverently trailing the cloth and wire likeness of some fantastical beast. "I'm a keeper," she said, shrugging. From what he understood, keepers did a wide variety of jobs, cleaning and maintaining the habitats. "Does that mean you take care of all these things?" "Heck no. They're a lot more useful in parts." Devlin's heart sank. Only then did he realize how fast it was beating. "It wasn't so useless last night." "I never said I'd disassemble all of them." She narrowed her eyes at him. "What now?" Devlin shifted his weight. "What do you mean, what?" "You've got that look again, like you disapprove of everything. No, like you hate it." She was uncomfortably close to the truth. "It seems a shame, is all," he muttered. His eyes caught on a wild assortment of colors and stitching. Almost instinctively, he knew without unburying it from the pile that it was a phoenix lantern. "When you're done admiring, help me find one with long wire segments." He briefly glanced back at her. "What for?" "The wires get repurposed for habitats." Of course, more destruction, so the humans could live better. Era set the lantern on the floor as she pulled out a figure. A squirrel lantern with giant, bright eyes. It captured the squirrel somehow, a creature of alertness and vulnerability. He felt a strange pang in his heart when Era pulled out a knife and began to cut through the fabric, skinning the lantern so neatly he almost thought it could be reconstructed. It never would be. Yet he watched her fold the fabric cover with care, setting it atop a crate instead of casting it onto the floor. Devlin's back stiffened. He shouldn't be here with her like this, helping her. The next time Era asked him if he wanted to go on an adventure, he would be sure to say no. Except, for some reason, when she asked him again a few days later, another yes flew out of his mouth. What in the immortal realms was wrong with him?
Chapter 5. Era. She'd been dreading this conversation. Era's feet dragged as she approached the structure she, her father, and Mason had all designed together, her walking stick poking holes in the barely trodden snow. The mound of scrap had a ramshackle, unplanned appearance for those who didn't know better. But from this distance, it was obvious. The library was almost perfectly domed, with an efficient little chimney puffing away through the oculus. She discovered Mason behind that cheerfully burning fireplace, his feet propped on a plastic crate with a shopping bag mat over it and a homespun shawl draped over his shoulders. She ducked her head as she approached, trying to catch the title of the book he read. "Don't think I've heard of that one." Mason yelped at the sound of her voice, losing the shawl off one shoulder and nearly dropping the book. A half-smile broke through Era's grim mood. Mason was the only person she knew who could literally shut out all the problems of the world by reading. He'd barely notice if the library was on fire. Trying to recover his dignity, Mason sat up straighter in his chair, removing his feet from the footrest as he ran a nervous palm over his wide braids. I told you to stop doing that. Couldn't help myself. Era sat on the cushioned plastic crate, her walking stick resting between her knees and Mason's shins. There was a thoughtless intimacy to the act, and no wonder. He was practically her stepfather. That didn't change, not even for a moment after her father died. Always with the mischief, Mason huffed, shaking his head. One day you're going to bite off more than you can chew with these pranks of yours. About that, she began, her mouth widening into a nervous grin. Every muscle in Mason's face tightened. What did you do? She brushed a few stray hairs back from her face, only for them to cling to her wool-mix gloves. The moment she freed them, they landed back in her face. Era, Mason warned. Remember the business about the dragon on the ridge? The one the supply team swore they saw? Mason's eyes narrowed. Well, it was a lantern, and I put it there. One of the team members knows it was me. Also Chef Beatrice, but only because he told her. Mason drew back with a hiss. At last he set down his book. In that moment, Era knew she was in for it. You can't keep violating rules like this, Era. Where are you going to go if the leadership kicks you out before winter's end? Where are we going to go? She muttered. It's not like this is the only settlement left in Cleveland. Because all the others will be thrilled to share their dwindling supplies with more folks. You know everything is calculated down to the mouthful this time of year. Come on, Mason. Era nudged his boot with her own. You're just spinning out now. I'm trying to look out for you. Kneading his forehead with his fingertips, Mason leaned forward over his knees, careful of the worn book in his lap. Who was it anyway? Maybe we can convince them not to say anything. She winced. Devlin Song. Devlin? Who, the new guy? The one with the scary-looking dad? Yep. The one who always looks like everything's a disappointment. That Devlin. He groaned. Oh, Era. Don't Era me. He's not going to talk. I mean, more than he already has. She hesitated. At least, I don't think he will. Rather than reassure him, her words only served to make Mason more suspicious. What makes you so sure? I took him down to storage to help me sort scrap. She scratched at her still thawing nose. He doesn't have permission to leave the safe zone outside of supply runs. If I get in trouble for going out of bounds during restricted hours, so will he. He won't tell. He's new, Era. They'll just warn him to take it more seriously. They've already warned you several times. Era snorted. They haven't caught me that much. The leadership here isn't that sharp. You're hopeless, you know that? Mason sat back. She patted his hand affectionately. So what's the book? His worried expression softened a touch as he answered. Romeo and Juliet. It came in the supply run, can you believe it? Another Shakespeare play still kicking around this sorry old world, and not in terrible shape either. Have you heard of this one? She shook her head. That just worries me more. Mason lifted the book from his lap, turning as if he could see something new in its faded cover. Creased so many times, it was like a roadmap of all the people who had read it. I'll talk to Chef, and maybe to this Devlin kid. Thanks, Mason. You're the best. Era jumped to her feet so quickly, she was instantly dizzy. But that didn't stop her. She held onto her walking stick a little tighter and strode from the library before Mason could change his mind.
Chapter 6. Devlin. Romeo and Juliet? Mystified, Devlin turned the yellow book over in his hands, sparing a glance for the people around him in the food line. Romeo, the librarian corrected him. You do great in that role. I'm hoping Era will agree to be Juliet. That wouldn't be weird for you two, will it? With all the time you've been spending together, I assumed you're more than friends. More than friends? He wasn't even supposed to be friends with a human, let alone something more than that. What was more, anyway? Surely he didn't mean. Devlin swallowed. No, absolutely not. Ice phoenixes didn't have petty emotions. They didn't develop crushes. Hearts of ice weren't made to warm to humans and their short-sighted whims. But the librarian was right. Devlin had been spending a ridiculous amount of time with Era. Not that it felt ridiculous. No, it felt, well, it almost felt nice. His cheeks heated at once. Devlin tried to give the book back to the librarian. Instead, he found it being pressed into his hands once more. You will love it, the librarian insisted. People used to perform it all over the world for hundreds of years. A play's the perfect way to help the winter go by. So what do you say? Devlin hunched his shoulders. No thanks. Don't dismiss it so quickly. It's pretty great. You just have to get used to the way the language flows. Frowning, Devlin cracked open the book. It didn't even look like English. Not that he'd admit he couldn't understand it. When the librarian approached him, his first question had been, Did they teach you to read where you came from? Devlin knew that wasn't a given, but being asked that directly, as if a phoenix couldn't learn this simple human language, had hurt his pride a little. He didn't want this Mason guy to think he couldn't handle a little pre-collapse English. Yet when he scanned the sticky pages of this book, Devlin's throat bobbed. This was gibberish. The words looked familiar, but the way they were strung together, did people really talk like this? Did this even count as English? Give it a try, the librarian encouraged, clapping him on the shoulder. Devlin fought the urge to recoil from the contact. I'll be interested to see what you think of it. Before Devlin could object, the librarian just drifted away, back to his spot further ahead in the food line. A furrow in his brow, Devlin scanned the room for his father, then tucked the book under his jacket. There was no way he could let Cyril see it, and no way he could explain that to Mason either. He'd just have to read it in secret. The night Devlin finished Romeo and Juliet, he felt it again, that uncomfortable heat that made him sweat. He went to sleep that night practically grinding his teeth, the book safely hidden within the discarded layers of his blankets. The very moment his father left with the trade team that morning, Devlin burst out into the cold, searching for the right ropeway to reach the library. He found the overly warm space just as Mason was bending over a shelf, replacing a book. The librarian's head snapped up in surprise. Oh, hey, Devlin. Era's not here, if that's who you're looking for. It wasn't, though Devlin instantly wondered where she was. His mind was brimming with far too many wrong thoughts, and worse, far too many cares for these humans and what they did, even the fictitious ones. Why did they die at the end? Devlin demanded, yanking the book from beneath his jacket. It was so stupid. Didn't I warn you? That play's one of the bard's tragedies. One of them. Did humans enjoy being sad on purpose? Not that Devlin felt sad reading it. That would be impossible. Ice phoenixes didn't feel such things. It must have been discomfort. That was it. But his unhelpful mind was at it again. What if, it prompted him, you really did feel sadness? What if you once felt agony and grief? Impossible. If he could feel such things, why hadn't he in this lifetime? Didn't the play make you feel them? His wicked mind prodded him. Don't pretend you didn't understand. Devlin shoved the questions down. Ice phoenixes had frozen hearts for a reason. He was spared sadness and anger, spared all the emotions of other phoenixes. So why was he so angry now? No one would choose to do what they did, Devlin insisted, the fingers holding the book turning white. Why was he getting so upset over a stupid human book? Play, his traitor mind corrected him. He wished he could shut it up. So why did they? Mason asked him, his head tilting slightly. What drove Romeo and Juliet to do what they did? Stop thinking about feelings and just answer the question, Devlin encouraged himself. Because they were idiots, he grumbled. The way the librarian threw his head back, laughing, made Devlin want to run the other way. They weren't idiots, Mason said, still smiling, though love makes people do stupid things all the time. They didn't stop to think, I'll give you that, but put yourself in their place. Romeo and Juliet came from rival merchant families. They'd been raised with the importance of money, class, and hating their rivals. But when they met each other, they finally got to experience something more to life. They experienced love, despite everything they'd been raised to believe. Maybe they didn't want to go back to the cold world they knew before. Devlin's lip curled. Maybe they should have kept hating each other. Again, Mason chuckled. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been much of a play. It doesn't make for much of a life, either, his mind prompted him. Devlin gingerly set the book on the low shelving beside him. He should just go. Instead, he shifted his weight once or twice before saying, Did it really end so badly? The families stopped feuding. Mason's brows hung low over his eyes. The young couple died, and Juliet's cousin Thibaut, too. Their families had to live with the guilt of what they'd driven Romeo and Juliet to long after. If they hadn't been so determined to carry on the feud, all those people would still be alive. All those people. All those humans. The thought settled in like a punch to Devlin's gut, like he'd just peeled back a protective layer and found something rotten beneath. He nearly doubled over. What's wrong? Mason asked, his amused expression flipping to one of concern. Nothing. Devlin gripped the edge of the bookshelf. You don't look fine, Devlin. Hey! Devlin was out the door at once. He felt as though he were on fire as he raced down to the creek that ran through the old zoo, skidding and dropping to his knees in the heavy snow. He needed to get cold and fast. Hand over hand, Devlin dragged himself to the edge of the frigid creek. When he was close enough to drag his fingertips through the instantly numbing flow of water, he paused, waiting for relief. Instead, he felt sick. Sick of himself. Sick of his mission. Sick of the true immortals who weren't even here anymore. And he and Cyril still had to do what they said. And he was actually sick. His stomach began to heave. Well, he dragged himself this far. Wild-eyed, he stared at the rush of water. There was nothing left to do now but jump in. Something was holding Devlin back, literally. Water poured off him as his upper body flopped onto the rough stone he could barely feel. Devlin heard a grunt, maybe his own, as the cold water of Lake Erie left his lungs. When someone freed his legs, it was as if they were disconnected from his body. Devlin's lids fluttered open just as that someone rolled him onto his side, hitting his back as he coughed up more water. A piece of rebar jutted out from the broken concrete of a pier. When the last of the water was out, Devlin wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand. A useless gesture. Every bit of him was both wet and numb. Slowly his vision panned to reveal the concerned face of his father. Concern. Another emotion Devlin had been spared. Until now. Images of humans frozen to death in their settlements, of children succumbing to the 9 viruses, of supply teams forever lost in the snow, all things Devlin had contributed to, if not caused directly, flashed through his mind. Devlin gripped the sides of his head. Once the whir of images began, he could not get it to stop. Cyril clucked his tongue at his son. You said you would do better this time. Did I? Devlin managed. I don't remember. For heaven's sake, your teeth are chattering. Cyril offered him nothing. Not a dry coat, not his phoenix fire, not a warm, reassuring touch. Look at yourself, son. If carrying out our mission was easy, the last immortals wouldn't have entrusted it to us phoenixes. I can't keep doing this. Oh, Devlin. Cyril let out a disgusted sigh, his lip curling into a sneer. I can't believe you'd let yourself get to this state again. What was it this time? This time, has this happened before?
Was it a girl? It's usually a girl.
His father reached out at last, but not to offer him reassurance. He shook Devlin roughly.
Hey, son, answer me.
Book.
What was that?
It was a book. Cyril's dismay flashed with anger as he eyed him.
What book?
Library. About hate, feuding families, loss. Cyril huffed, then stood, shucking lake water from his denim and wool coat.
I'll take care of that later. First, we have to do something about that ice around your heart.
Hurts, Devlin managed through his violently chattering teeth, realizing only as it said it that it did. His heart, or something even deeper inside of him, ached so fiercely he couldn't imagine how it would ever end. Need to get warm. He spat out lake water.
No, son, you need to be colder. Much, much colder.
What?
Trust me, son. This is for your own good. This is going to protect you.
What's going to protect me? Slowly, the shattered pieces of Devlin's heart began to knit themselves back together, and it burned like the touch of freezing water. Except he wasn't being reforged with his father's help. The ice around his heart was reforming, stealing the breath from his chest. Somewhere, behind all the agony that darkened Devlin's vision, it dawned on him. He wasn't born with ice for a heart. He wasn't born without feelings. Cyril had done this to him. This wasn't his ice phoenix nature that hid his emotions. This was magic, his own father's magic. Cyril's face hung close to his own, eyes narrowed.
When you're yourself again,
his father murmured over the crash of waves on the pier,
return to the habitats immediately. I should have everything taken care of by then.
Devlin's body trembled as he fought the stricture of magic growing through his heart. No, he stammered.
Hush.
At last, Cyril reached out, stroking Devlin's hair, who tried to jerk away.
That's not you talking. That's your weakness.
My weakness. As pain overwhelmed Devlin, Cyril's back receded along with it. Devlin had to fight his father's magic. He needed to regain his emotions, no matter how horrible it would be. No matter how his guilt would destroy him, he had to remember, because he needed to stop his father before they killed anyone else. And to do that, Devlin would need all his strength. He needed his phoenix form. Frost crept over Devlin's skin, clawing inward toward his heart as he held on to the scraps of painful memories he'd already located. He doubled over, gritting his teeth as he forced a shift through the magic his father had placed upon him. He pictured his arm bones lengthening into powerful wings, the finger distending, his skin stretching and pocking with dimples as his ice-white feathers began to push through. Sweat dampened his back, his brow. Nothing happened. Not a single downy feather emerged. The ice crept onward, his emotions and memories being slowly devoured by his father's wicked spell. Think phoenix thoughts, a voice said, filtering through the pain of that spell taking hold. It was a memory, his memory of a woman who radiated something he almost could not identify. It was love. One glimpse of this memory and Devlin knew he had belonged to her and she to him, an ice phoenix. He must have been young at the time and in a previous life. The memory tasted of metallic soot, of what the world had been in the early decades after the fall. The woman had a smooth face, wrinkles appearing only as she smiled, but she was older. Too old, perhaps, to be his mother. Was she his grandmother? It's important to be able to change your form at will so you can walk amongst the humans, the woman continued in his memory. She stretched out his younger self's arms, positioning them like flapping wings. That is the true mission of phoenixes, to stand between the immortals and mortals. It's why we're still here. Even after the true immortals have gone, that duty and freedom is why the phoenix still flies. Do you remember the old saying I told you? His cheeks reddening, Devlin lowered his head. His grandmother merely shifted his arms as if they sailed on an updraft. "The world ends and begins with the phoenix," she repeated. With a guttural scream, Devlin forced his arms outward, and with them, the first of his feathers tore free. The soft glow of transformation lit the center of his chest. As that icy light brightened, it shone outward through the layers of his clothing, twining around his arms, shifting his body and bones in a swirl of light. And as his inner magic strengthened, it burned away the power of his father's spell until it was no more than bitter ash. Devlin stretched his wings, his elegant tail unfurling in a display of feathers as white as snow and as blue as a frozen lake. He beat his wings, his bones cracking as they settled into place. With a final cry, he ascended until he was part of the sky at last. The ice phoenix pointed the graceful curve of his beak toward the habitats.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Thaw, a Phoenix Heart, Part 1, by CK Beggan, narrated by Karyne Norton and Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Kate, go to ckbeggan.com to find more of her books. She does write both spicy and sweet romance, but clearly labels them, so be sure to keep your preferred heat level in mind when checking out her books. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. As always, I will have links for all those sites in the show notes. I love getting emails from you all telling me which episodes are your favorite and how you started listening. It keeps me encouraged and motivates me to keep making more episodes when it can sometimes feel like I'm just throwing these episodes into the internet void. I'm also especially thankful for the kind reviews that help people find the podcast. Queen Bee TX said, "Love this podcast. A great alternative to listening to long books. Good for in-between books, limited time, a change of pace, or simply enjoyment. Lots of variety." I'm glad you've found this podcast to be so helpful, Queen Bee TX, and I hope others do too. If you've enjoyed the podcast but haven't had a chance to leave a review, I hope you'll take a few minutes out of your day to do so. I'll have instructions in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.